I don't know about you folks. I spend a lot of time on the internet, a lot. And if there's one thing that people, and especially dudes on the internet, love and guard with their lives, it's freedom of speech. Or at least what they understand freedom of speech to be. I call this type of viewpoint internet libertarianism. And it's the kind of thing that, like, on its face, it really seems perfectly reasonable, perfectly defensible. But once you kind of peek under the hood a little bit, you see that, I mean, the freedom of speech that they hold so dear is really a very flawed understanding of what freedom of speech actually is, as well as its corollary concept of censorship. So my first run-in with the internet libertarian crowd took place last summer. Some of you might remember the campaign of harassment endured by a feminist media critic named Anita Sarkeesian. She was doing a Kickstarter, a crowdfunding campaign, to try and raise money to create a video series that looks at how women are represented in video games. Do I have any gamers in the house? Yeah? Okay. Ooh, enthusiastic response. I mean, if you play games, and even if you don't, you might have some sense that although things have come a relatively long way in the last, decade or so, the way that women are represented in video games is pretty dismal. There are a lot fewer female characters than male characters, particularly when it comes to significant characters in games and protagonists and the like. And the women who are in games are typically pretty hypersexualized, pretty objectified. So, but unfortunately, there are quite a lot of people who are in the gaming community, or at least they're very vocal, who are perfectly happy with this state of affairs, and they have no interest in seeing anyone tinker with the women in their video games. It's a very territorial thing. So, they see Anita Sarkeesian's campaign, and even though, she hadn't even done anything yet, she hadn't even put her 2 cents in on the deal with women in video games. She was just trying to raise money to do it. But something triggered the, the sexist gamer bat signal, and she ended up, the stuff that they did to her was really quite horrific. In addition to, of course, besieging her YouTube channel and her Kickstarter page with misogynistic comments ranging from, make me a sandwich, bitch, to, death and rape threats. And not only that, but they defaced her Wikipedia page, they were pretty vigilant about editing it to make sure that it said stuff about how she's a former sex worker and, just really awful, well, not awful, but just not true. People making pornographic drawings of her, people doing pornographic photoshops of her, and worst of all, a guy made a video game about her. And it's a crude flash game that's basically just a close-up shot of her face. And the player is encouraged to click on her face to watch bruises and contusions and gashes appear on her face until she's basically a bloody pulp. It was horrific. So I was following the whole case with quite a lot of interest and concern, and then one morning in July, a Friday morning, a couple of sites published stories about how this video game had been made. And that was kind of the last straw for me. I see this happen, and I'm just, so filled with disgust and horror, and carrying on all these really breathlessly disgusted Facebook and Twitter conversations with people about, how in the world could somebody do something like this? And finally, my sister says, well, does anyone know who this guy is? And it occurred to me that one of the articles published about the game did mention that he was from Sault Ste. Marie, which, relatively close to home. I figure if they know that he's from Sault Ste. Marie, they must know something about who he is. So I visited that article, and there was a link to the place where the game had been hosted. And when I visited that link, the game had been taken down because a number of users flagged it and were like, this is terrifying and misogynistic. But the description of the game was still there, as well as the username of the person who created it, Bendelin Spur. And that, Bendelin Spur, that sounded like a real name to me. So I thought I would, poke around the internet, see if I could find any other, see if Bendel and Spur had tracks on any other platforms that I actually had an account on and could engage in a conversation with him on. So on the internet, Twitter is where I live. That's where I spend like far too many hours a day. It's also actually the perfect place to have this kind of conversation. First of all, it's a conversational medium. Anyone can talk to anyone, and word can spread very quickly. So a lot of people use Twitter to give feedback to, say a restaurant that they visited, or a product that they purchased, or a movie that they saw. And they can just tweet about it, or they can tag the person or people or organizations who are responsible for that if they want that person to know, I saw your movie and it was a piece of crap, or like, I came across your video game and it's a misogynistic, black hole. So it just seemed like a good way to confront this guy. And the fact of the matter was, all these people had been floating feedback about the game on Twitter and Facebook all day. They just weren't able to, I wanted to make him directly privy to that feedback. So I looked him up on Twitter, and lo and behold, there was Bendel and Spur. So I tweeted at him, and I basically just asked him if his behavior and attitudes toward women offline mirrored what we saw in the game, which is essentially a violent hatred of women for expressing a feminist opinion. And that tweet got retweeted about, like a couple hundred times, and before I knew it, Bendelin and I and hundreds or maybe even thousands of people were embroiled in this very heated weekend-long Twitter fight or Twitter discussion, which it was interesting. But I mean, the vast majority of people who were participating in this conversation definitely agreed with me. They thought the game was deplorable, and they were there to tell Bendelin what they thought about it. But there were definitely, I also attracted my fair share of Bendelin supporters, some of whom were not especially shy about lobbing death and rape threats in my direction as well, unsurprisingly. But I noticed that amongst these guys, and it was pretty much exclusively guys, I'm not generalizing here, I kept coming across the same arguments over and over and over again. So one of the arguments I saw a lot was, we don't hate Anita because she's a woman or because she's a feminist. We hate her because she's selfish enough to ask for free money, which, well, that's what everybody on Kickstarter is doing. So there's that. And then secondly, and this is really cute, Bendel and Spur actually had his own active crowdfunding campaign at the time to raise money for his own project. So that argument went in the trash pretty damn quick. But another argument that just kept coming up over and over again was that, that my confrontation with Bendelin and the ensuing, torrent of criticism that he faced amounted to censorship, an attack on Bendelin Spur's freedom of expression. So, I mean, I really can't wrap my head around this viewpoint, and I think it cheapens the concept of censorship completely. Here's the thing. First of all, censorship in its really kind of nuts and bolts, like legal definition, it's about a government or an institution suppressing a viewpoint or suppressing dissent. It's not about individuals suppressing anything. But furthermore, even if we're not going to look at it in the legal sense, I mean, censorship is not, it requires the removal of something. It requires restricting other people's access to a particular thing. And if anything, I was increasing the access to this particular thing. I was making that conversation available to more people. So it really kind of blew my mind that, that this was considered censorship. And I mean, the reality is, like, what they were defending was not freedom of speech. It was freedom from criticism. And, while I know nobody likes to take criticism, we're all, pretty defensive about it sometimes. His pain at being, at people saying, your game is horrible, your game is misogynistic, and by extension, I think you're a horrible misogynist. That probably not very nice to hear. But imagine how painful it was for Anita Sarkeesian to come across this video game that's simulating her physical brutalization. Imagine how painful it was for all the people who came across that game and are survivors of domestic violence themselves. Really, his pain at hearing bad things about himself that hurt his feelings, it pales in comparison, and he earned it in ways that Anita Sarkeesian did not. You can't just put something horrible out into the world and then dust your hands of it and hide behind the brick wall of freedom of speech. Like, nobody is asking for Bendelin Spur to get thrown in jail. Nobody was asking for him to be burned at the stake. And I wasn't even party to the game being removed from the damn website in the first place, which I guess is like the closest thing that you could say counted as censorship in the whole debacle. That was, you know, before I even came on the scene. I was about starting a discussion. And, like, censorship, I mean, as I said, it's the removal, right? It's the restriction. And what I did instead was actually kind of the opposite of freedom of speech because, or sorry, not the opposite of freedom of speech, that's crazy. No, it was the opposite of censorship because I was, first of all, exercising my own freedom of speech in response to how he had chosen to express himself. My choice was to meet what I saw as harmful or damaging speech with more speech that gets us to really dive into what was problematic about the game. And in addition to that, it was a place for people, like I was creating a conversation where people who disagreed with each other could engage directly with one another. So instead of you know, me and other people agreeing on Facebook about how horrifying the game is, while he and his pals agreed on, like, you know, the men's rights subreddit about how legitimate and awesome the game was, I was creating a space on Twitter where we could disagree and engage with each other and, you know, hopefully walk away from it with, like, having learned something would be nice. The space to disagree, I think that the freedom to disagree is in a lot of ways kind of what freedom of speech and freedom of expression is all about. So I really took issue with being told that I was censoring somebody, and it's really gotten me thinking about how people engage with each other on the internet and how it can kind of seem a bit cacophonous at times. You know, but at the end of the day, we have the right to freedom of speech, and then we have the responsibilities that come along with it. And Bendelin Spur, the way that he used his freedom of speech, you know, it really warranted some response. So I was glad that I was able to start a conversation about it, and I certainly hope that he learned something about censorship in the process. Thank you.